and disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Good afternoon. You're watching and listening to The Discussion with me, Anaya Falarin Iman, where we discuss the big moral, cultural and political questions of our time. We've got a show packed for you this afternoon, with the Labour Party edging ahead of the Tories in the polls. Can they win back the red wall? And also, what are the facts and the fiction in the gender and sex debate? And with national debates continuing to rage about history, how should we understand the past? All that and much more just after the bulletins.
Good afternoon, I'm Olivia Guthrie. These are your latest headlines. The Education Secretary's become the first government minister to back reducing the isolation period from 7 to 5 days, as he thinks it would help tackle teaching staff shortages. Nadeem Zahawi says there's no doubt staff absences levels will rise in schools as pupils return, and that the next 2 weeks will be bumpy. Well, Mr Zahawi's also insisting lateral flow tests will remain free following reports they could be limited to high-risk settings. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and the Labour Party had criticised such a wrong-headed move. But Mr Zahawi says he's puzzled by a report in the Sunday Times suggesting their universal availability might be axed. Meanwhile, the UK has reached a total COVID-related death toll of more than 150,000 since the pandemic began. Court documents claim the Australian government did not give Novak Djokovic an assurance his medical exemption to enter the country would be accepted. The tennis player's legal team has said the authorities indicated he met the requirements for quarantine-free entry. Djokovic is spending a fourth day in an immigration detention centre ahead of a court hearing tomorrow. Immigration lawyer Harjap Singh Bandal says there's a lot at stake for the world number one.
He has to win it, otherwise he faces a re-entry ban of 3 years to 10 years.
Oh, wow.
Potentially losing millions of dollars. So I think he's stuck in that place where he knows that if I get deported now, I won't be allowed back for a minimum 3 years, hence losing a lot of money. So it's something that he has to win, perhaps in a situation where if he just walked away at the start, it might not have got this far.
The Housing Secretary is expected to put pressure on developers to pay to replace dangerous cladding on low-rise flats. Michael Gove will set out his plans for helping leaseholders trapped in unsafe and unsellable homes tomorrow. But Labour says other non-cladding related costs need to be included in his announcement. Giles Grover lives in a flat with dangerous cladding. He says the measures don't go far enough.
Cladding is a start, but the problem is that, as many politicians have said, you can't make buildings half safe. So you can focus on cladding and say, OK, we'll pay, as we are doing for my building, paying for half of it. We've still paid about been asked to pay about £6,000 or £7,000, and we don't know when the project is going to end. So it's a good start, but we're not there yet.
The Foreign Secretary says she's prepared to override unilaterally parts of the post-Brexit agreement on Northern Ireland if negotiations fail. Writing in the Sunday Telegraph, Liz Truss warns she's willing to trigger Article 16, which would suspend parts of the treaty designed to prevent a hard border with the Republic. She's meeting her EU counterpart next week for face-to-face talks. Talking to GB News earlier, former First Minister of Northern Ireland, Arlene Foster, accused the EU of having double standards.
In fact, they've said, it would cause serious consequences if it was triggered by the United Kingdom, despite the fact, of course, that they triggered it last January in terms of the supply of vaccine exports. They then withdrew it, but in withdrawing it, they said they reserved the right to do it again if necessary.
The biggest ever space telescope mirror has now moved into place and could soon explore the depths of the universe. Well, that isn't the telescope at all. That's Kate, who has just turned 40. The Duchess of Cambridge has released these 3 new portraits to mark her birthday today. Fashion photographer Paolo Roversi took the pictures, which show Kate in a series of Alexander McQueen dresses with her hair flowing behind her. She's also wearing a pair of earrings that once belonged to her mother-in-law, Diana, Princess of Wales. Bright and colourful northern lights have appeared in Finland's Lapland region, colouring the sky green. The lights began dancing in the sky early this evening, or yesterday evening, I should say, and the bright arches could be seen for almost an hour. According to a photographer who captured the scene, these were some of the biggest and most picturesque auroras of the past couple of years. 3:06, that's all for now. Let's get back to Anaya.
Welcome back to the discussion. Well, from controversies around acclaimed author J.K. Rowling's views on gender identity to philosopher Kathleen Stock resigning from the University of Sussex following a campaign of intimidation against her for her views on gender self-identification, to debates about the inclusion of transgender women in female sports, prisons, refuges and other single-sex spaces. Over the last few years, the subject of sex and gender identity have catapulted to the forefront of the public debate. But what is really going on here? Why has this debate become so controversial? And what are the facts and the fiction in the gender and sex debate? Well, I'm very excited to be joined by James Esses, who is a trainee psychotherapist and children's counsellor, to hopefully attempt to demystify this subject for our audience and including myself. So firstly, the first question I want to ask you, James, is what is the difference between sex and gender? Because I think that this is even something that has been quite confusing. We hear that, sex is biological and gender is a kind of social construct, but increasingly that's being used interchangeably, and those divisions are also being questioned as well. What, in your understanding, is the difference and what those things mean?
And look, it sounds like a simple question, but it's absolutely crucial, and the two get completely conflated these days. So sex is born out of biology. It's binary, it's immutable, rather male or female. Gender is made up of a variety of other things. It is, in many ways, a form of social construct, but it relates to one's environment, one's culture, one's upbringing. It could be seen as how masculine or how feminine one feels. But the crucial thing to state is this: how somebody feels about their gender does not change their biological sex.
And so what is the difference between transgender people and intersex people?
Well, intersex people, and this is quite a broad term, but it's people who are born in such a way that it's not entirely clear, possibly from their chromosomes or from their genitals, whether they are male or female. Now, the vast majority of these people, it's quite clear whether they're predominantly male or female, but sometimes, when we're talking about human development, things can go awry, there can be deviations. So intersex is kind of a form of condition in that respect. Transgenderism now, historically was people who felt that they were born in the wrong body and they felt that their gender identity did not align with their biological sex. But what we're looking towards today, and I'm sure we'll get onto it, is this idea of self-ID, where anybody can simply state, well, actually, I'm a man or I'm a woman, irrespective of their biological sex. And
so moving on to that question, because we have since 2004 the Gender Recognition Act, and I'm assuming the presumption of the Act is to accommodate the tiny minority of people who feel a sense of incongruence between their biological sex and their gender identity. So could you tell me a bit more about the Gender Recognition Act, and what are some of the proposed changes to that which has caused so much debate?
Correct. So, as it stands, in order to gain a gender recognition certificate, there's a number of loopholes that you must go through. For example, you must be diagnosed with gender dysphoria, which is a mental health condition. You must have lived in the other gender, sex, for a period of 2 years. You must pay a small fee. At the end of that period, you can be issued with a certificate saying that you are the other gender legally. The proposals that are coming nowadays are that actually we should scrap medicalisation. There should be no requirement for a diagnosis, for living in that gender for a period of years, and that you should simply be able to self-identify as male or female, depending on how you feel.
And what are the arguments that people put forward for that? Because it has been backed by some organisations, that the Women and Equalities Committee have recommended it, Stonewall have recommended it, and obviously, you know, it's also had pushback from different groups, radical feminist groups, religious groups, some LGBT groups. But what is their argument in favour of allowing people to self-identify as whichever gender?
Well, their argument is basically, as you just put it, it's that I am how I feel, everything is subjective, and if I say I am something, you know, I am. But actually, there's quite a few concerns about some of these proposals. For example, again, we can't even agree on the definitions of sex or gender, and in that Women and Equalities report, the two were used completely interchangeably. Equally, if we move away from this idea of needing to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria, what we're doing is we're moving away from a medical model, but we have to accept, and the statistics show that the vast majority, particularly of children who feel that they're born in the wrong bodies, eventually, with time, with explorative therapy, will settle into their biological sex. If we move it away from needing a diagnosis and people receiving therapeutic help, then we're potentially missing out on all of those children, those young people who might eventually settle into their sex.
Yeah, but some of the, there's even been changes within some psychology institutions. You know, there's been talk online about the DSM now using sex assigned at birth and things like that. I mean, what do you make of that? Even within some scientific establishments, they are seemingly embracing the gender self-identification way of thinking.
Well, it's quite concerning because it appears that a lot of these institutions have basically been captured by an ideology. I mean, sex assigned at birth is factually incorrect. You know, sex is observed and recorded. But yes, we're seeing that with a lot of therapeutic organisations, a lot of medical schools. Even I've seen school materials that have been taught to primary and secondary school students using this type of language. And it was there in the Women and Equalities Committee report, which suggests to me and many others that actually they're not taking a neutral perspective of this. They've basically just adopted a controversial ideology. And
there's been some criticisms of the way in which, as you mentioned, transgender kids or kids that express confusion about their gender identity, how they're being treated. There's a move seemingly towards the affirmation model where you affirm what they are saying. Is that correct?
Well, this is the concern. I mean, the government's proposal to ban conversion therapy has significant risks associated with this because we've seen this happen in other countries, and the wording can be so vague, so ambiguous, that it could potentially criminalise basic ethical explorative therapy.
So what should we do if you have a child, you know, but that's going through puberty, that is saying that they have a massive sense of uncomfortability with their own body, that they want to become the opposite sex or the opposite gender, depending on where you're coming from on this? You know, what should people do?
They should, of course, be respectful. They should listen and try and understand. I mean, that's the purposes of therapy, to explore, to understand these things. But putting children down a potentially one-way street towards irreversible medication and surgery is not the answer. So I mentioned earlier a statistic which showed that most children with gender dysphoria eventually settle into their sexes. Well, there's another study that's shown that most children who are put on puberty blockers will eventually go on and take cross-sex hormones. So it's almost a slippery slope towards further medicalisation. I mean, a few years ago, it felt like we were moving away from stereotypes. We were moving towards this idea that it's okay to be a more masculine girl or a more feminine boy. But nowadays, this seems to have gone out the window. And I'm hearing of younger and younger children. For example, I read a story recently of a very young girl who enjoyed playing with boys' toys and the colour blue. And her mother took her to the doctor because she felt that she must be a boy trapped in a girl's body. We're actually regressing back towards stereotypes, and that's not very progressive.
Well, why do you think that this has happened? I mean, it does seem that this is exploded really in the last few years, this discussion. I've seen some statistics that actually by a few 100% now girls are wanting to go to the clinic, and before it was actually primarily boys wanting to change their gender, and now it's overtaking girls. I mean, why do you think that this has exploded?
Well, what you're talking about has been dubbed rapid onset gender dysphoria, but you're right, the statistics have completely shifted, and now it's girls tend to be in their adolescence or teenage years. there's a lot of different arguments as why this is happening. One is that it's kind of a form of social contagion. We've seen this, for example, in certain schools in which anorexia tends to spread about, and a lot of girls in one class can start to suffer from this. And the argument is that it's much the same here, actually.
But some people, critics of what you're saying, will say actually it's the fact that we've become more accepting, and that's why more people that otherwise would have suppressed their internal difficulties are now coming out in ways that they otherwise wouldn't have. And they would say that what you're saying is actually making it more difficult for trans kids and even transgender adults to actually get the kind of help that they need.
Well, it's interesting that they say that, because there's a concern in the gay community that actually affirmative therapy, allowing people to transition, it could be a form of gay conversion therapy. The stats show that the majority of children with gender dysphoria end up coming out as gay. And if you recall, there was some controversy in the Tavistock a couple of years ago, in which a lot of parents were being documented as coming through to the clinic concerned that their children were gay. And I've heard anecdotally in some cultures and communities that parents would rather have a child who was trapped in the wrong body and straight than gay. So actually there's some concerns that this is far from accepting, and actually we could be basically converting quite a few gay children into being trans but straight.
Well, so many things, so many people would say, that the high rates of suicide, they will point to the fact that transgender people face discrimination. And even if there is some confusions, ultimately we want to live in a society where, people are not experiencing those things. And so in a mature and compassionate society, we make accommodations for those kinds of people. What do you make of that argument?
I don't dispute that argument, and that we should treat everybody with respect, with common decency. I mean, I would say, and maybe we'll come back to this, but that's not often forthcoming from the other side of the argument. Often they can be the most aggressive and insulting. But yes, of course we should treat people with respect, but that doesn't mean foregoing the rights of other people. I mean, a lot is in the news at the moment about safe spaces for women and same-sex spaces. For fear of not hurting the feelings of a group of people, should we then trample upon the rights of others to feel safe and secure? I mean, my argument would be no, and a lot of women are up in arms at the moment at the prospect of potentially biological men being able to access safe spaces, whether it's women's refuges or changing rooms or female prisons.
Well, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, James Aces, who's a trainee psychotherapist and children's counsellor, talking to us about the gender and sex debate. Thank you. Well, coming up, as a new year and a few days has passed since the January 6th storming of the US Capitol, we're exploring what those shocking events tell us about American democracy today. And also, as the Colston 4 verdict has reignited debates about British history, we're asking, how should we understand the past? But first, it's the weather.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Away after sunset here. There's a similar picture for Scotland, with clear skies developing as showers ease into the evening. It will turn cold under the clear skies, especially in the east. Although it will be a dry end to the day for Northern Ireland, high cloud will already be edging eastwards through the evening, helping to keep temperatures a little milder. Looking ahead to tomorrow, cloud and hill fog will gradually edge eastwards overnight, with patchy outbreaks of rain and drizzle affecting many western areas. And that's how the weather's shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panelists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join me, Mark White, here on GB News. For more than 2 decades, I've been at the sharp end of reporting crime and security at home and abroad. From the scourge of terrorism to the fight against violent crime and the deepening small boats crisis in the Channel, they're issues you rightly care about, and so do I. As GB News Home and Security Editor, my focus will be on the stories that matter to you.
Welcome back to the discussion. It's 3:22 in the afternoon. And this week, the 4 people involved in the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020 who were accused of illegally removing a statue of the slave owner and philanthropist Edward Colston in Bristol were cleared of criminal damage. The jury accepted the argument put forward by the protesters' lawyers that they had a lawful excuse to remove the statue because the continued erection of the statue in the centre of Bristol represented a form of veneration which amounted to a hate crime. The verdict has divided public opinion and reignited a heated national debate about race, history, and the legacy of the British Empire. Well, therefore, in today's moral dilemmas, we're asking, how should we understand the past? Joining me to discuss this in the studio is James Hartfield, historian and author of the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, A History. And down the line, we are joined by Professor Robert Toombs, Professor Emeritus of French History at the University of Cambridge and the author of The English and Their History, the First 13 Centuries, and also Professor Alan Lester, Professor of Historical Geography at the University of Sussex and author of Ruling the World, Freedom, Civilization and Liberalism in the 19th Century British Empire. So this is a very meaty subject. Thank you all for joining me this afternoon. I'll start with you, Professor Alan Lester. We've had many debates now about kind of British Empire and its legacy, but what's very interesting in the Colston Fort verdict, Tom Wainwright, a barrister of one of the Colston Four, said the toppling of the statue had helped heal the wounds of slavery. He accused the prosecution of inviting the jury to pick open the wounds once again. Do you agree with those statements?
Yeah, I think if we're going to heal the wounds of the legacies of the British Empire, which was an empire founded in a belief in white supremacy, then we have to have a built memorial landscape that is more reflective of an inclusive national story, not a story of someone who earned their money and distributed their philanthropy through the enslavement of Africans and the deaths of some 19,000, the enslavement of 80,000 of them. So I think provided there isn't a backlash, which we often see against progressive reform movements, then the removal of Colston's statue, and until recently its display in a museum where it could be properly contextualised, is a way of producing a more reconciliatory history that recognises black experience of empire as well as white people's experience of empire. I also don't think that the legal case sets a precedent. I'm not a lawyer, but I understand from lawyers that it sets no precedent, that this was a case considered by a jury as befits the rule of law in this country. And I don't expect that there will be mobs of protesters pulling down statues all across the rest of the country. I think the precedent that it does set is that we can take each of our statues in our memorial landscape on its own merits, and we can have a mature, grown-up discussion about whether these figures represent the kind of inclusive society that we want in the future. I certainly don't think that contextualising statues, either in place or in museums, is destroying history. I'm actually very grateful to the Bristol protesters, because before they came along, statues tended to be these sort of bronze lumps of metal whose only purpose was to attract bird poo and the odd traffic cone. And since the tearing down of Colston's statue, we've had an opening of debate and a raised consciousness about the nature of the British Empire.
And Professor Toombs, I mean, what do you say to those arguments? Because even though this is a specific incident, the Colston situation, it has been embedded in a wider context of conversations we've been having over the last year or so about statues, and it has actually bleeded into conversations about other figures such as Churchill and so on. So do you agree that this is really specific in relation to Colston, or do you think this has broader implications for our understanding of history more broadly?
Well, I think Colston was a very marginal figure, not a very important figure in history, and indeed almost entirely forgotten until his statue was pulled down. So I don't think we should exaggerate the significance of the Colston issue. But I think, yes, I think we have to be aware of the use of history for political purposes. Now, you could say, well, it's always been used for political purposes, but that's not a reason for saying we should not be very aware of the way it can be used. And I think, for example, there seems to be an attempt to, as it were, recast our history as being essentially one of racism and exploitation and violence, which is, of course, part of our history, as of the history of all countries. But the selective emphasis on certain aspects of history seems really to be aimed at putting across a present political message, which is essentially that we are a racist society because of our history. And I think that that's simply untrue and unhelpful.
And James Hartford, I mean, do you agree with Professor Toombs on this? I mean, you were involved in anti-racist activism, and I mean, what do you make of this as being a kind of movement to make history more inclusive? I mean, one of the things that often, surprises me is actually how little young people know about anything other than kind of slavery and colonialism. If you ask them about perhaps the Chartists and the Levellers and other aspects of British history, they are often less aware of those things.
Well, I think if anybody who's taught history is obviously thrilled that it ever becomes a news topic. So it's very exciting that we get a chance to talk about these statues. I don't know if it's exactly contextualised if you knock it over and stick it in a museum, but the jury's decided, so that's kind of happened. I think there's some parts of the discussion now which are, I feel, are slightly grandstanding, where people talk as if we never talked about slavery. But I studied slavery when I went to school in the 1970s. My mother, who was a teacher in South London, she was. We showed Kunta Kinte's story in the. That great TV series in all the schools. So people have talked about slavery a lot, and I think it's a bit of a myth to say we never ever talked about it. So I guess there is a degree of grandstanding, but and a kind of forgetfulness about the past, that we don't really, each generation imagines they are the first people to have discovered the horrors of slavery, but really that's not true.
And Professor Lester, what do you say to that? That actually, we know Black History Month has existed for decades now. Most young people are taught about, slavery and colonialism in schools, and actually, there's many aspects of history that young people don't know at all. So this idea that this is us making a more inclusive, a more accurate representation of our knowledge of slavery doesn't really feel like the reality of actually what's really been taught over the last few decades.
OK, well, first of all, the empire is not reducible to slavery. Slavery was an episode which affected primarily the transatlantic sphere of empire. So we had new societies built on the importation of enslaved people from Africa, which built the societies of the Caribbean, the American colonies, before they became independent. But empire existed across the world. There are other components of empire. There was a diaspora of 20 million Britons during the 19th century to dispossess indigenous peoples of their lands in North America, in Australia,
but
in New Zealand.
Professor, on that specific question about, actually this is being taught and actually it has been taught for several decades and it's not actually accurate.
I'm trying to answer that question. Those wider aspects of empire are not being taught. We have a national curriculum that pays far more attention to 1 century of Tudor rule 400 years ago than it does to 3 centuries of British rule, which reconfigured most of the globe, well beyond transatlantic slavery. So we don't teach in school about the settler colonies, about this massive diaspora of 20 million Britons and their impact on indigenous peoples around the world. We're also not mentioning yet the British Empire in India, which was colonised by a private company whose source of wealth came from taxing Indians for the benefit of being governed by British shareholders. Now, if we had a national curriculum that truly reflected the breadth of empire, pre, during, post-slavery, and these other dimensions of an exploitative system that was justified by white supremacist ideas, then I think we would start to get to grips with the reality of British history.
And Professor Toombs, finally, have you seen any evidence that necessarily having a stronger understanding or a wider understanding of the British Empire necessarily makes people better in the present day?
Well, it depends what they're taught. If you're taught that the British Empire was about slavery and racism, and you're not taught that it was the major force in abolishing global slavery, then it will have a certain effect on your view of your own country and its past. No one thinks that you should whitewash the past and leave out the bad things, but there seems to be a tendency to leave out the good things. India, yes, it was colonized by a private company, or it was ruled by a private company. It was never colonized. And yet the Indian economy, according to Indian economic historians, benefited from development during that period. So I think, you have to look at this in the round and try to teach the whole story and not just pick out the bits that you either like or dislike.
Well, thank you all for joining me this afternoon. James Hartford, historian and author of the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society of History, and also Professor Robert Toombs, Professor Emeritus of French History at the University of Cambridge and author of The English and Their History, the First 13th Century, and also Professor Alan Lester, Professor of Historical Geography at the University of Sussex and author of Ruling the World, Freedom, Civilization and Liberalism in the 19th Century British Empire. It's a very big discussion. Hopefully we touched on some many important issues raised about the Colston Fort and wider debates about British history. Well, coming up, as a new year and a few days have passed since January 6th storming of the Capitol, we're exploring those shocking events and what they tell us about American democracy today. And with the Labour Party edging ahead in the polls against the Tories, can they win back the Red Wall? But first, here's the news and here's the bulletins.
Good afternoon, I'm Polly Middlehurst with your latest news headlines. The Education Secretary has become the first government minister to back reducing the isolation period in COVID from 7 to 5 days. Nadhim Zahawi thinks it would help tackle teaching staff shortages, warning absences will rise in the next 2 weeks as pupils return to school. Mr Zahawi is also insisting lateral flow tests will remain free following reports they could be limited to high-risk settings. Meanwhile, Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, and the Labour Party had criticised the move as wrong-headed. Meanwhile, the UK has reached a total COVID-related death toll of more than 150,000 since the pandemic began. Court documents claim Australia's government did not give Novak Djokovic assurance his medical exemption to enter the country would be accepted. His legal team said authorities indicated he met the requirements for the quarantine-free entry. Player Renata Vorakova from the Czech Republic has now left the country after having her visa cancelled. And the Duchess of Cambridge has released 3 new portraits to mark turning 40 years old today. Fashion photographer Paola Reversi took the birthday pictures, which show Kate in a series of Alexander McQueen dresses and wearing earrings that once belonged to Princess Diana. Bright and colourful northern lights have appeared in Finland's Lapland region, colouring the sky green. According to a local photographer who captured the scene, these were some of the biggest and most picturesque auroras of the past couple of years. Beautiful they are too. You're up to date. I'm back in half an hour. See you then.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Welcome back to the discussion with me, Anaya Falarin Iman. This week, US President Joe Biden accused Donald Trump and his supporters of holding a dagger at the throat of democracy. This was, of course, part of his commemoration service on Thursday, marking the anniversary of the storming of the US Capitol by more than 1,000 Donald Trump supporters last year. 5 people died either shortly before, during or following the event, and many people were injured, including 138 police officers. The event sent shockwaves through America and continued to provoke wide-ranging questions about the state of American democracy, polarization, public distrust of elites, and the role social media and the legacy media play in exacerbating societal tensions. Lots to get stuck into. Well, joining me to discuss this is Batya Ungar-Sargon, Deputy Opinion Editor of Newsweek and author of Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. Thank you so much for joining me, Batya. I mean, firstly, do you think that the storming of the Capitol Hill last year was a threat to American democracy?
So first of all, thank you so much for having me, Anaya. I, along with, I'm sure, many of your listeners and viewers, feel so grateful to you for the sober-minded and intelligent analysis you bring to free speech questions across the board. So thank you for all of that. I'm really grateful, and I'm grateful to be here. I find it really hard to identify with the level of hysteria around January 6th, especially when it comes to questions of democracy. And the reason for that is that Donald Trump got 74 24 million votes in America, and about 700 people have been charged with some form of trespassing, criminal misbehavior, attacking police officers on January 6th. And I just fail to see how 700 people, they're not even reflective of, 1% of his supporters. I spoke to Trump supporters on that day for most of the afternoon. I watched Fox News all day, and everybody was condemning the violence that we saw on that day. And so to me, this seems more a reflection of the elites for the first time being in the crosshairs of something like this than it does of really a threat to our democracy.
One of the things that really frustrates me, Batcha, I mean, whilst the storming of the Capitol was, a disaster, I mean, sometimes it seems like people fail to see the violence, often within the wider context of the violence that was going on that year, and the rioting and violence that happened in many different cities across America around Black Lives Matter. I mean, do you smell any kind of hypocrisy there in the strength of condemnation that we had, particularly from kind of liberal legacy media, and the kind of reaction from the broader political establishment in America in terms of those different forms of violence?
There absolutely is. And I'll just take it one step further, Anaya. There is violence going on right now at record highs in inner cities across America. Over 100 Black children were murdered last year, and you will never, ever hear a liberal politician talking about this. How is that acceptable? Our neighbors are living in war zones, and we sit here and go, talk endlessly about a riot that, yes, was violent, yes, was worthy of condemnation, yes, every single one of those people who committed a crime should go to jail and will go to jail and are going to jail. And meanwhile, there's this inner city violence that no one will talk about. Talk about a threat to democracy when children can't go to school without being worried about being shot. Isn't that a real threat to our democracy? Not to hear our liberal politicians talk about it. And I find that to be the height of hypocrisy, and a murderous kind of hypocrisy.
I think many people will echo your sentiments, Batcha. But also on the question of big tech as well. I mean, now we have a former president essentially removed from the digital public sphere, and many people were saying, well, he can join another social media outlet, and there was all of the controversies around that. And actually, I mean, at least from the perspective of people in the UK and myself, it does feel like Donald Trump has been silenced. We rarely hear about him or hear what he says anymore, because the main medium to which he communicated was through social media. And that has been removed. I mean, what are the implications now of big tech companies with a huge unaccountable power being able to remove huge or significant figures in the public sphere away from the public conversation?
So I have to admit, I'm conflicted about this because I have my own emotional, personal response. I think a lot of us feel so much relief that we don't have to read articles and watch news coverage 24/7 of his ridiculous tweeting, right? So there's, on that personal level, this feeling of relief because the elites on the left are so obsessed with him that every time he says something, that's all they can talk about. But at the same time, of course, to deplatform a sitting president, it's insane. And who is on the side of those tech elites that are doing all of this work to silence conservatives? Of course, you see this sort of handshake agreement between them and the liberal establishment that's calling increasingly for censorship, not just of people like Donald Trump, who maybe did incite violence on January 6th, but increasingly anybody who sort of falls afoul of their, liberal mores. How much longer will J.K. Rowling be allowed to tweet, right? So I think that the implications, exactly like you say, are enormous and really problematic, and really show that new alignment on the left between big tech and, increasingly Wall Street and liberal and very progressive legislators as well.
And finally, Batcha, I mean, how do we go beyond this? Because it does seem to be, getting worse. I mean, we see huge sections of Republican voters still believing that the election was stolen, despite it being unsubstantiated. We see many of the big tech companies, as we just mentioned, and also the liberal media coalescing around Joe Biden. And you mentioned J.K. Rowling and all of the controversies we're seeing around many important issues that seem to be unable to have a reasonable public debate about it. I mean, do you have any sense of how we go beyond this polarization?
So in America, and I'm wondering if this is true in the UK as well, polarization is a completely elite phenomenon. Our political and chattering classes are making millions of dollars and getting a lot of power out of telling Americans that we are deeply divided, and nothing could be further from the truth. When you get out and talk to working class Americans, middle class Americans, they don't care at all about politics. They care about putting food on the table, and they are so not polarized over the major issues that our great nation was founded on. And so to me, you know, we're seeing a mass boycott of the news because Americans are too smart to buy all of this nonsense that they're being fed. And I hope we see more of that. And I hope that Americans find their voice to resist all of this, because we know that we're much more united than we are divided.
Well, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon from America. Batya Ungar-Sargon, Deputy Opinion Editor at Newsweek and author of Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. Now, in finally other news, this week, in his first speech in the new year, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer put patriotism at the heart of the Labour Party strategy to win support from voters. He stated it is precisely because we are patriotic that Labour wants to correct things like the rising cost of living, tax rises, fear of crime and challenges to getting a quick appointment from the GP. Starmer's appeals to patriotism have been widely seen as an attempt to regain trust from the Red Wall voters in particular. This speech comes as opinion polls over the last few weeks have shown a consistent poll lead for Labour after lagging behind the Tories in the polls for nearly a year. Joining me now to discuss this, firstly, is James Hartford, who is a lecturer and academic. Thank you, James. I mean, what do you think about this? Because it seems to be all crumbling for the Tories, and the Labour Party strategy has been partly to, you know, allow the Tories to collapse in on themselves. But actually, is that really what is necessary or needed to rise to some of the interests and desires and aspirations of the Red Wall voters in particular in 2019?
Well, I think you've put your finger on it, because the what we can see, it seems reasonably likely that the Conservatives might well lose the Red Wall. I mean, if these polling figures get bedded in, which looks like what's going to happen, then it may well be that Labour MPs get elected across those northern constituencies again. But what we don't see is the Labour Party winning the hearts and minds of those people, and the relationship they've established is not very strong with those voters. So it's much more of a case of two parties failing, you know, one failing worse than the other, rather than winning.
Yeah. Do you think that Keir Starmer can really reclaim his patriotic mantle following him being the architect of the second referendum policy? I think people still sometimes see themselves through the Leave versus Remain divisions and identity still. And I think many Leavers would find it really hard to let go of that sense that he essentially was part of the movement to undermine democracy.
It is a big deal, and I know from my time in the North campaigning around the issue that it was a very big deal. I think, but the biggest problem for Starmer is perhaps not just that where he was on Leave or Remain, but where he was, that he's like a weather vane. You know, he swings, and I think people read that. There's a real, the voters have a real strong nose for phoniness, and if they think that you're not sincere, you can't quite cut through. It's okay to contain the problem that when you're being challenged over patriotism, say, I am patriotic. But if the voters don't really believe it, they think it's a performance, it won't win them, it won't win their hearts and minds.
So what do you think Labour could do to win the public hearts and minds? I mean, we had the controversy, you know, during the Labour conference about him being unable to say women have cervixes. He even said, no, you shouldn't say that, that's not right. And so for a lot of people that, you know, you can't really think a politician can be taken seriously if he can't even make some kind of firm statements like that. I mean, do you think there's anything that the Labour Party can do to really win voters back?
On that, I think it's not bad what the leadership is trying to do, because if I read it right, they're trying to listen more to the voters and less to their core constituency. And Labour's big problem is that its membership and its MPs are really from one kind of clique in society, and its supporters are not really the same. And the people in Islington and London are kind of into trans rights and equal opportunities and those things. And the voters are not against that, but they're just not moved by it in the same way, and they don't recognise themselves in some of those issues.
Well, thank you, James Hartford, historian and lecturer. We are now joined on the phone by Labour MP for Birmingham Berry Barr, Khalid Mahmood. Thank you for joining me this afternoon, Mr. Mahmood. I mean, what do you think that Labour can win back the Red Wall? And if yes, what do you think that they can do to win back the Red Wall?
Well, look, first of all, yes, absolutely. We can win back the Red Wall voters. We're already doing that. I think people see that they loaned their vote to Boris, and the fact is the whole thing has been totally fake and a very bad experience for them all. So I think there's a real issue with that. I think now, with the policies that Keir is putting forward, only this week he came to Birmingham to launch the issue of security, prosperity, and respect, which are the lines that we'll be working our policies on. And I think...
But which policies? Which policies did he announce?
He announced the basic agenda for policies, which is the security, prosperity, and respect.
But no one disagrees with that, surely.
No, please, if I can just say a word. These are the basic outlines that have been put forward for the next general election. And in part of that, there's a huge amount of policies, and I'll go through those policies. I'll go through the policies in terms of built in Britain, which certainly the defence team has started off of British industry, and the business Secretary of State, Shadow Secretary of State is also looking at that. It is how we get our industries back up and running, how we invest money into them. When the government has put 15 billion back into defence, why are we still not getting those jobs being translated into British contracts? We're out of Europe now, and what we're pushing for is those people like myself who trained as engineers, who have that expertise, skills expertise on the shop floor, are not getting those jobs. The Labour Party will push for those jobs. The Chancellor has said that she will cut business rates to allow businesses to start to develop and get those high streets back up and running, and to make sure we do that. We're looking at housing investment and how we can move that forward.
If I may, I mean, you're mentioning that a lot of voters lent their vote to Boris Johnson, and I think that is correct. But I mean, why should voters trust Keir Starmer? I mean, he was the architect of the second referendum policy, which to some extent led to Boris Johnson getting his 80-seat majority, and it did sow a lot of distrust in people that were previously lifelong Labour voters. So why should voters trust Keir Starmer this time?
Jeremy was the leader of the party. We had to go with the policies when we have a democratic elected leader. We go with the policies as a democratic collective to move on those policies. That's what we do, and that's what we should do, and that's what happened. With that, obviously, that whether we believed in it or not, there were issues within the party to do that, but you have to go with collective responsibility. That's what Keir did. He's now in leadership for himself, and he's decided and outlined what he wants to do, and that is what we should be looking at.
And Wes Streeting, appeared to open up a dialogue about transgender issues in an interview with Nick Robinson on the BBC the other day. And it did seem to slightly differ from some of the line that Keir Starmer was taking in relation to saying that women, that we shouldn't say that only women have a cervix. I mean, what do you make of this? Do you think that this is the Labour Party moving away from maybe more radical, kind of hard left identity politics and taking a much more nuanced position on this issue?
I think, look, as far as the Labour Party is concerned, the Labour Party, some people out of London, I made this call in April this year when I stepped down from my front bench position, saying that we've got to move away from the bourgeoisie London and the wokeness that's going on entrapping the Labour Party. Keir Starmer is doing that now. He's coming out to the rest of the country as well, looking at people that are employed, and in London as well, people that have to get up in the morning or go and do a night shift, go and actually physically work in their place, who can't just work online from their homes or wherever they are. We have to get those people who have to get up every morning, every day to go to work, and that's what Keir is doing.
And do you think that Mr. Mahmood is right there, that actually Labour should start thinking about the material issues, James. Do you agree with that and move away from the issues of kind of identity and things like that?
I think a lot of people will be thinking about the material issues. They'll be thinking about fuel bills, and I think so. That makes sense. Unfortunately, this isn't a happy answer, but the pain of the culture wars has to be gone through one way or another, because all the words are out now. So somehow we have to find a way to get back to talking sensibly. And I thought Wes Streeting's intervention was very good, because at least he was saying, let's talk. And that's a much stronger position than you're wrong, which is all about backing into corners. So I thought that was a positive sign. No,
that's really good. I mean, so going forward, Mr. Mahmood, I mean, do you feel like your trust has been rebuilt? Obviously, you resigned from the front bench and so on, and you mentioned your comments about, bourgeois, London-centric, woke, etc. Do you feel confident about the direction the Labour Party is going on now?
I am confident. I'm confident with Keir Starmer. I've met him. I've spoken to him. He is looking at these issues now which affect ordinary people who have to work for a living, whether they're stacking shelves or whether they're working in this industry at the cutting edge of industrial development. And all those people need to be engaged and be together with. And we have to carry the whole country. And that's what he wants to do. We have to support all people looking at the key issues that affect the nation, and that's how we're going to move forward.
And what about the process to which Keir Starmer has got there? I mean, people that were backers of Jeremy Corbyn would say that, he's pushed this through in an anti-democratic way, and it's effectively him marginalising a significant and influential section of the Labour Party, momentum, and so on and so forth. I mean, what do you make of those criticisms? Would you say that he's been democratic in the way that he's actually changed the direction of the Labour Party?
He's been very democratic. He's got most of the changes that he wanted through the annual conference, and that's where it starts from. Our democracy, very much unlike the Conservative democracy, is based through things that were passed through the annual conference. He's done that. He's working with all of the party, and I think the division that people are trying to present in terms of the hard left, we've always had a core of the left. Even when Tony Blair was the Prime Minister, we had a huge majority. That's part of what Labour Party is. But at the end of the day, majority of the party now is looking forward to move forward to work on the policies that affect the country and not just internal policy thinking about where we should be on the spectrum of the left or the right, but actually working towards working and supporting people.
Well, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Khaled Mahmood, Labour MP for Birmingham, Perry Barr, and also James Hartfield, historian and lecturer. Well, I hope you enjoyed this afternoon's show. That's all from me and my guests on the discussion. I'll be back at the same time next week. Up next, it's Nana Queer.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
So looking ahead then to this evening's weather, and the UK looking rather drier with showers easing and clear spells, although rain arrives in the southwest. Let's take a look at the detail then. The southwest of England already cloudy with hill fog edging eastwards. Outbreaks of rain already across much of Devon and Cornwall. In contrast, drier and clearer across the southeast. Winds will be easing, which will allow temperatures to fall away. It's going to be much drier for South Wales, but cloud already thickening from the southwest with some hill fog and light rain possible. And much clearer skies across the Midlands, where it's going to be mostly dry. The odd shower possible there, especially towards the north, but remaining mostly dry. Temperatures falling away under clear skies. And those showers easing over the northeast of England this evening, with increasing amounts of clear skies developing, those clearing skies, easing, winds allowing temperatures to quickly fall away after sunset. And a similar picture too for Scotland. Clear skies again developing as those showers ease into the evening, turning colder under the skies, especially in the east. So although it's a dry end to the day for Northern Ireland, high cloud will already be edging eastwards through the evening, helping to keep those temperatures a little milder. And looking ahead to tomorrow, cloud and hill fog gradually edging eastwards overnight, with patchy outbreaks of rain and drizzle affecting many western areas. And that's how the weather's shaping up overnight into tomorrow and for tomorrow morning.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Hello, good afternoon and welcome to GB News on your TV and on digital radio. I'm Nana Akweer, and for the next 2 hours, me and my panel will be taking on some of those big topics that are hitting the headlines right now. This show is all about opinion. It's mine, it's theirs, and of course, it's yours. We'll be debating, discussing, and at times we will disagree, but no one will be cancelled. So joining me today is broadcaster Danny Kelly and actor and writer Yanis Morgan. Before we get started, though, let's get your latest news headlines.
Very good afternoon to you. It's 4 o'clock. Here I am, Polly Millhurst, with the latest news. Don't know why I said it like that. So the headlines this hour: the Education Secretary has become the first government minister to back reducing the isolation period from 7 to 5 days, as he thinks it would help tackling teaching staff shortages. Nadeem Zahawi said there's no doubt staff absences will rise as pupils return to school, and that means the next 2 weeks could be bumpy. Mr Zahawi is also insisting lateral flow tests will remain free following reports they could be limited to high-risk settings. Meanwhile, Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, and the Labour Party had criticised such a wrong-headed move. But Mr Zahawi says he's puzzled by a report in the Sunday Times suggesting their universal availability may be axed. Meanwhile, the UK's reached a total COVID-related death toll of more than 150,000 since the pandemic began. In Australia, court documents claim the Australian government did not give Novak Djokovic an assurance his medical exemption to enter the country would be accepted. The tennis player's legal team has said the authorities indicated he met the requirements for quarantine-free entry. Djokovic is spending a fourth day in an immigration detention centre ahead of a court hearing tomorrow. One immigration lawyer says there's a lot at stake for the world number one.
He has to win it, otherwise he faces a re-entry ban of 3 years to 10 years.
Oh, wow.
Potentially losing millions of dollars. Yeah. So I think he's stuck in that place where he knows that if I get deported now, I won't be allowed back for a minimum 3 years, hence losing a lot of money. So it's something that he has to win, perhaps in a situation where if he just walked away,